Our topic tonight is the Transatlantic Agenda, the modest title, covering a few matters of some interest common to the United States, Germany, and other countries of the world. It's a terrific title. All of us recognize the long-standing friendship between the United States and the countries of Europe. It's been the very foundation of our foreign policy since World War II. We all have been concerned about, interested in, and appreciate the value of NATO within our foreign policy, usually the thing most emphasized. And of course today, we all recognize the important role of both Europe and the United States with respect to the global economy. Together we constitute probably half of the global economy, and we have shared interests. There's hardly an issue of American foreign policy which isn't shared with the countries of Europe. And Germany is certainly a primary representative of those nations. So it's with a great deal of interest that we look forward to the ambassador's presentation concerning this agenda, which is so rich with respect to the interests of the United States as well as Europe. The ambassador has a long and interesting career, which I'll mention only in abbreviation. Although I will mention his abitur is from his hometown in Essen, and he studied after being in the German military for a short period of time. He attended a school in Idaho, the University of, it's not the University of Iowa, the College of Idaho, which I must admit I heard of for the first time, Mr. Ambassador, in looking at your resume. But he studied psychology, sociology while there, and that was a taste of the United States. His education continued in the United States. He was at the Fletcher School, the Harvard Law School, the John F. Kennedy School of Government. He received degrees, master's and PhD, from the Fletcher School of International Law and Diplomacy. I should mention parenthetically, he also studied law in Germany, at Bonn, Freiburg, Geneva. Geneva not being in Germany, obviously. Thank you. I was waiting to be corrected there. And his experience within the foreign ministry, which he joined in the 1970s, is extensive. The early experience overseas Ecuador and some jobs with respect to Asia and the policy planning staff of the foreign ministry. Later was posted to the United Nations, and later within the foreign ministry he handled a wide variety of tasks. I should note that he was director of the Office of the Secretaries General of three Secretaries General of NATO, and within the foreign ministry held impressive and important responsibilities with respect to defense and international security, including heading up the Directorate of International Affairs and North American Relations. He served in the highest civilian office within the foreign ministry as Secretary of State in the foreign ministry, and I should note he also headed the private offices of several, or at least two, of the German foreign ministers. During the course of those responsibilities, obviously, the affairs of NATO were huge, but also international law. And then when you look at the specific things that he's dealt with, they range from the bringing in of Eastern Europe into NATO, the relations with Russia, touches on matters with Iran. There's hardly an issue of foreign policy that's of interest to we Americans that hasn't crossed his desk in a very significant way, and certainly there's nothing that hasn't crossed his mind, at least. So in short, a terrific career, a varied career, and one which is of huge interest to us. It's our great pleasure to have with us this evening the Ambassador of the Federal Republic of Germany, Klaus Scharioth.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, Frank Bird, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here in Baltimore. I apologize that I came a bit late, but there was traffic, and I appreciate that all of you made it, because I had the feeling there were many people on the road who were almost not making it, wherever they went. I would very much like to enter into discussion after my remarks, and therefore I will limit myself in my initial remarks to maybe 9-10 the most important problems on the agenda. So that doesn't mean there are more, but I don't want to lose all of you here in my talk, and therefore I will limit myself to 9 or 10. But before I do that, let me make a very general comment. The general comment is that in the 34 years which I now spent in the Foreign Ministry and the Foreign Service of Germany, the agenda has totally changed. When I joined the service, the agenda, when we talked to the United States, the agenda was the Cold War, it was Germany, it was the protection of Berlin, and we were extremely grateful that you stood shoulder to shoulder with us in the Cold War, that you protected our freedom in Berlin, for instance, with the Berlin airlift, that you sent your presidents to Germany when spirits were low. Kennedy said, "Ich bin ein Berliner." Ronald Reagan said, "Michael Gorbachev, open this gate, tear down this wall." And before all, I'm fully aware that without the United States, we would not have been able to reunify our country in 1990. I was there in those so-called 2+4 talks, so I know what I'm talking about. I can say, without you, without the United States, without your support, we would not have been able to make it, because the window was shortly open only. So that is the first period in my professional career. Between when I entered the service in 1990, it was mostly Germany, Berlin, the division of Europe, Cold War. Then, after 1990, it was how to overcome the consequences of this painful division which Europe had lived through for some 45 years. And so we talked about the real reunification of Europe. That means transformation of NATO, transformation of the European Union, the Balkans, wars over there, Bosnia, Macedonia, all these things, Kosovo. And that for another 10 years was the agenda. It was Europe. But now, and that is really remarkable, now the agenda, when we talk to the United States, when Chancellor Merkel talks to President Obama, or our foreign ministers talk, the agenda has nothing to do with Germany, or nothing to do with Europe. It's a global agenda. What do we talk about? We talk about the financial and economic crisis, which is global. We talk about nuclear non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament, which is global. We talk about climate change and energy security, which is a global problem. We talk about terrorism, or call it violent extremism, which is global. We talk about failing states or failed states, another global problem. Or we might talk about things like Afghanistan, concerns not really only Europe or the United States, Iran, Mideast, or a new partnership with Russia, maybe the only thing which has a European color, a European flavor. So we have a totally different agenda. We have a global agenda. We have problems of a global nature. And my first thesis is that in today's world, not a single country, certainly not Germany, certainly not Europe, But not even the mighty United States, the most powerful country in the world, not a single country can solve any of these problems alone. What follows from that? It follows that we need to work together, that we have to cooperate, that we have to brainstorm together, that we have to analyze these problems and others, which I did not mention, together, that we decide together what to do, and that we ideally also take joint action. That is, in my view, very important to remember, because it follows that we need to be together, and that we need to work together, and that we need to think together and take action together. So after these general remarks, allow me to say a few words about each of at least those 9 topics which I just mentioned. Let me start with the economic and financial crisis. It concerns everybody. It's a worldwide phenomenon. And if I start with the economic crisis, I can say that we in Germany were lucky that we got out of it maybe a bit faster than the United States. We have already a lower unemployment now than we did have before the crisis. And we also have a growth rate, which isn't bad, 3.7% this year. Why could we get out of the recession a bit quicker? There's, I would say, one main reason, and that main reason, there are of course many others, but one main reason, that we introduced a policy which is called short-time work. And that means, let's say in the big recession which we had, you have a company, let's say you employ about 100 employees, and the demand for the product you are selling is cut by half. In the United States, you don't have much but a choice but to lay off 50 of your 100 people because you don't have the revenue. In Germany, you could do the same thing, but you have an alternative. And the alternative is that you tell your 100 employees, now, each of us works instead of 40 hours, 20 hours. And you get from me, the employer, only 50% of your salary because you work instead of 40 hours, 20. But the difference now is that the German government picks up 2/3 of the remainder. And that means that everybody who even works only 20 hours has about 85% of his salary. And that, of course, led to 3 things. It first led to the fact that we didn't have a drop in consumption. Germany was one of the very few countries in the world where consumption did not drop during the recession. And the second consequence, of course, was that you didn't have people who were anxious, who were on the street, who were afraid what the future would bring, because if you had a job, if you have 20% if you have 20 hours and 85% of your income, maybe a little bit more if you worked more hours, that's a different story. And therefore, we did not have any foreclosures, because if you have 85% of your income, you can pay for the essential stuff. There's 1/3 advantage of that, and that is that the companies could keep their skilled labor. And that is maybe the most important one, especially for a country like Germany, which depends on skilled labor, because we still make things, we manufacture a lot. 25% of our GDP comes still from manufacturing. And therefore, we need skilled labor. And I'm told by business people that depending on the kind of work people do, you need about 8 to 12 months to train a new employee so that he or she is up to speed. And so the great thing about this short-time work is that once the recession was over, you could, or began to get over, you could say as an employer, now you work instead of 20, 24 hours, or 28, or 35, or whatever. And so you could immediately slightly increase production, and you didn't have to rehire anyone, which would, of course, cause a certain amount of delay because you would have to train people. And so I think the reason that after the big recession, the economy picked up first in Germany is, I think, due to that fact. So that is the economic crisis. I think we have a good chance to get mostly over it very soon. We believe, however, that we have to do whatever we can to prevent that such a crisis could ever happen again. As you all know, the origin was a financial crisis. It was the financial markets. And there was not enough oversight over the financial markets. And therefore, we believe that we have to agree, and again, this is a global task, that we have to agree on an architecture where there is not a single market, not a single player, and not a single financial product without oversight. Because that's what got us into trouble. The rating agencies being paid by those they were rating, and I don't have to go into the detail. Maybe we can touch on that in the discussion. But there is no doubt that it was the financial sector who brought us into this mess worldwide. Now, again, this you can only solve if you do it together, because if we would just create oversight, let's say in Frankfurt or in New York, then the financial institutions would go to Dubai or to wherever, you know? So you have to do it globally. And that's why it was tackled in the so-called G20 in November 2008. The first meeting was in Washington. And the good news is that the G20, 20 countries who stand for more than 90% of world GDP, that those 20 countries could agree on the main problems. Basically, we defined at the time the 47 most urgent problem areas. That's the good news. The bad news is we didn't solve them yet. At least not all 47. We solved about 20, and unfortunately not the most important ones, but I mean some we did solve. But there are about 25 to go, and therefore this process will have to continue. I repeat, a global process. My second issue I would like to touch upon is nuclear proliferation and nuclear disarmament. Why is that so important? It is important because I believe if we don't take relatively radical action, you will have, in about 15 or 20 years, a world in which you don't have 8 nuclear weapon countries, but something like 20 or 25. And I think that would be very dangerous, and at least I would not like my children to live in such a world. You see, I lived throughout my youth in Germany, and in the Cold War, we of course knew that if there would have been a nuclear exchange, practically no one in my country would have survived. But I still believe that the situation today, as dangerous as it was in the Cold War, might be more dangerous than it was then. Why? Because when you have 20 or 25 nuclear weapon countries, not all of them have what you in the United States and what also the Soviet Union had, an elite which knew about how to not use nuclear weapons, about deterrence, about you had a red telephone after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And when you have 20 or 25 nuclear weapon countries, you couldn't be sure that all those very dangerous weapons would be safe from terrorists. That, I think, is the greatest danger which we are facing, that a terrorist would get his hands on a nuclear weapon. And I think you can pretty much rule it out in countries like the United States or Russia or France or Britain. I think their nuclear weapons are safe. But would they be safe in a country I won't name because I want to keep my job, so I don't name any countries. But you can figure out what I'm talking about. And so I think we have to take radical action. And I'm very pleased that President Obama is, I think, the first, or was the first, who saw that there is a connection between this great danger of nuclear proliferation and nuclear disarmament. You can only make the case to those countries which would like to acquire nuclear weapons, mostly for reasons of status. And, I mean, let's face it, nuclear weapons are not that usable. But, I mean, it's a status question. And therefore, you have to bring the status of nuclear weapons down. And that's exactly what the US is doing with our full support. Germany fully supports that agenda. And we believe that what has been done, for instance, on New START, is very remarkable. It's a 30% reduction of nuclear strategic weapons. But more important, it is verification. And verification has helped us a lot in the Cold War. Once you have transparency, once you know what the other side does, I think the danger of use is much less than it would be otherwise. And therefore, we also fully support the nuclear posture review of the Obama administration, which basically made 3 very important changes, as I believe. First, it reduced the importance, the salience, as it's called in the text, of nuclear weapons. Other things became equally important, conventional weapons. Second, it said that the United States would not use nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear weapon state who is in good standing with the non-proliferation treaty. That's another way to say except Iran, basically. That's a great thing because it's a great incentive not to acquire nuclear weapons, because then the US weapons could not be used against you. And the third thing, which I think is quite revolutionary, is that the United States said that it would not construct, not devise new nuclear weapons. And again, this is an incentive for others not to do likewise. I believe the chances are significantly better than ever before that this policy could succeed, and we in Germany fully support that. Let me turn to climate change and energy independence, which I also believe is one of the most urgent problems which we are facing. Why is it so? I think by now science is unanimous, really unanimous, that if we don't act quickly, we will have disastrous consequences for world climate. And this would mean desertification of large areas of the world, overflooding of coastal areas. You would get, of course, refugees from those areas to other areas, and the impact would be tremendous. And that's why we believe we need to act quickly again. We believe that Cancun, the meeting which we just had last week, was not really a failure, but it was also not yet enough, not enough what we need. We need, again, because it's a global problem, it does not help if, let's say, just Denmark and Germany do something. We need everybody to act. And therefore, again, here, we have to agree between Europe and the United States what to do and how to do it. And we have to do that quickly. Because otherwise, there's no chance that China or India or Brazil or South Africa or others would agree and would do anything there. We in Germany, we have tried to do our part. We have reduced our CO2 emissions in comparison to 1990 by 28%. At the same time, we have increased our GDP net, that means without inflation, by more than 30%. So it's not true that if you reduce CO2 emissions, you lose growth. That's just a myth. Second, we have done that because we also would like to enhance our energy security. We import quite a lot of our oil and also of our gas, and therefore we have some 10 years ago begun to switch to renewable energy. And we have increased the share of renewable energy, mostly wind, but also solar and geothermal and others, from in 2001 from 6.5% to this year 18%, and we will have around 40% by 2020 and 80% by 2050. And that is, oh, thank you. I like that. And you see, I always like to say it's win-win-win, because we, by this policy, we do three things at the same time. We reduce CO2 emissions, which means a better environment. At the same time, we reduce our import bill. For instance, by the year 2020, we will spend every year 25 billion euros, which is about $30 billion less than we currently do. And now again, I don't want to mention any countries, but I can tell you where we get our oil from. Those are not all of the most reliable countries. I won't say more. And you see, in the old days, we got our oil mostly from Norway, the Netherlands, and the UK, and gas. But their resources are going down, so we have to turn to other countries. I won't mention whom. But anyhow, also one should know that when you import oil, for instance, from the Middle East, a certain amount of that money goes to terrorists. We all know that. So that's the second impact. The second part of our second reason is that we enhance the security of our energy supply and reduce our import bill. But there's a third aspect. The third aspect is that in the last 8 years, we have, just in renewable energy, created 280,000 jobs. 280,000 jobs, new jobs, and it is by now the fastest growing part, the fastest growing area of the German economy. Hard to believe, but still true. And I do not count yet in these 280,000 figures those which have to do with efficiency gains, because also there a whole new branch of industry is developing to produce efficiency, very efficient appliances and other things. Fourth topic can be short. I wouldn't say terrorism. I rather prefer the word violent extremism. I do not believe that we are in a war on terror, because a war is different. But we need to stand together and we need to face this challenge successfully, because this is not an attack against the United States. It is not an attack against Germany or Sweden or whomever. This is an attack against the open society. This is the open society. It's an attack against that what we stand for, the values of the Enlightenment, like rule of law, like freedom of the press, like the chance of the opposition to become the majority, human rights, freedom, democracy, personal liberty, all of that. What they want is a theocracy. What they want is a society which would be very different from the one we are used to in North America or in Europe. So we have to work together. We have to, and I'm happy to be able to report that our services in Germany and United States work very closely together. Failed states. Why is it important? We all believed until 9/11, 2001, that who would really care about failed states? Who would care if some country in Africa or distant Asia or wherever was no longer succeeding but failing? We all thought it's their problem. But we learned the hard way. We learned that we do pay a price if Afghanistan at that time was a failing state, and if the Taliban decides to rent out their territory to Al-Qaeda. That's what they did. And from there, the heinous attacks on the World Trade Center and here on the Pentagon, they were planned from there, and they were also, they trained also in Afghanistan for that. So it mustn't always be, of course, terrorists who take over a failing country. Sometimes it's just drug lords, sometimes it's organized crime, sometimes it is people who engage in human trafficking. But it has two things in common. It's all awful, and second, in each of those cases, we in our societies usually pay the price. And so that's why we have to get together, again, a global problem. We have to get together and have to see what we can do that other countries do not fail, and help them in trying to get good governance, in trying to help them establish themselves. Let me shortly mention also the other subjects which I mentioned at the beginning. Afghanistan, of course, I already said, as a failing state, needs our help. We in Germany supported intervention there in 2001, and we have been, from the very beginning, doing two things. We have been sending soldiers there, and for quite a while, Germany was the #1 troop contributor to ISAF. We are currently #3. We are having 5,000 soldiers there. But soldiers is only half of what we need to do, because, of course, security is important. And without security, you won't get economic development and modernization. But the other side of the coin is also true, that without development, without good governance, and without modernization, you won't get security. And that's why from the very beginning, we have tried to also do on the civil side, and it's not mostly a question of money, it's mostly a question of a different kind of ethics, and also a question of good governance. It's a question of trying to train people that they can run their country alone, that they can run their country without our help, because in the long run, foreigners should not be there. I think in the long run, everybody has to run their own country, and that's why we try to train doctors, lawyers, bureaucrats, prosecutors, teachers, journalists. I think that's what is needed, and we very much hope that we can succeed. But of course, again, we have to succeed together. It will be impossible for just one of us to succeed and if the others don't. So we have to do this together, and I'm happy to report that at the Lisbon summit of NATO, just a few weeks ago, we did agree on a common, comprehensive, and I believe very good strategy. Mideast, no alternative to what the United States is trying to do, to push for a two-state solution of two states who live in peace with each other. This is a problem which has repercussions for the whole region, and therefore it is a good idea to try to work hard to get it there. Again, this is not something the United States can do alone. We have the so-called quartet, in which you have, besides the United States, also the European Union, the United Nations, and also Russia. And I think we will have to do whatever we can to get back to direct talks and to get us to a solution, because time is not really on our side. We have to really try to move that forward. My last point is Russia. We, of course, we are not delighted about everything which happens in Russia. Sometimes we are quite exasperated. We have sometimes very difficult talks about things like human rights or rule of law or protection of the free press, or also how the opposition is treated. So there's no doubt about that. But having said that, there are many problems which we can solve only if we work together with Russia. First, for instance, the question of nuclear proliferation and nuclear disarmament. 95% of all nuclear weapons currently are in the United States and Russia. So if we want to move forward there, we need Russia. And second, if you look at, for instance, the question of Iran, maybe I should say a word about Iran too. If you want to move forward on Iran, you have to have Russia on board. Because if you don't, then it will be very easy for Iran to avoid our sanctions and to get their hands on nuclear material. And for many other problems, it's exactly the same. Therefore, I very much hope that the US Senate in the next few days will ratify New START, because we need New START for, first of all, for the verification it provides, also for reductions, but also if it would not be ratified, it would be a huge setback for this reset policy of the Obama administration, which we fully support. One last word on Iran. Iran is so important because if they would acquire nuclear weapons, you could imagine that other countries in the region would do exactly the same in a very short period. And that's why in 2003, Germany, together with Britain and France, raised that issue. And we told the Iranians, you have a choice. You could continue to do what you're doing, but we have to tell you that you have lost the confidence of the world community. We do not believe that your program is without any doubt just a civilian program. But if you would voluntarily forego those two things, which you don't need for a civilian program, but definitely need for a nuclear weapons program, and that is enrichment and reprocessing, then we could see that we would help to modernize your country. And in addition to that, we asked them to allow monitors of the International Atomic Energy Agency to Iran. And the surprising thing is that it did work. We sent our 3 foreign ministers to Tehran in October 2003, and Iran agreed to suspend enrichment, reprocessing, and they also agreed to allow monitors of the IAEA into their country. Unfortunately, as you all know, it lasted only for 2 years. In 2005, in the late summer, Iran suspended the suspension. But fortunately now, we have the United States on board, we have Russia on board, we have China on board, and therefore I'm quite optimistic that these talks, which have begun with Iran again on December 5 and 6, a week ago, that they can be successfully continued in January. Absolutely essential again that we work together, because none of us alone would have a chance to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. I stop here because I would love to get into a discussion. Thank you.
I should tell the ambassador, we didn't have a chance to talk when we came in.
Because I was late.
No. That's partially true, actually. No, you were on time. You weren't late. But we have to repeat our questions for the camera. And if this system works for you, I'll recognize the questioners, and repeat the question if that's not too clumsy for you.
You repeat the question?
Is that all right?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. The question is, what is your government doing to reach out to Americans of German heritage?
Thank you very much for the question. First of all, the good news is that people of German ancestry are the largest group of any other group here in the United States. You have 43 million Americans who are of German ancestry. That's more even than the UK. The UK has altogether only 31 million. And also Ireland has only 31 million. Italy has about 25. But I guess that Mexico, which is currently 5th, is coming up strong. But that's my private guess. Yeah, what are we doing? We believe that it is very, very important to have, first of all, an exchange between Americans and Germans. And so we have been trying to do whatever we can to increase, A, the number of Germans coming to the United States, students, businessmen, whatever, and B, to also increase the number of Americans who visit Germany for studies or for business purposes whatsoever. And that is quite successful. And I'm very pleased to be able to say that both numbers are increasing. And I'm also pleased to tell you that the number of Americans who learn German is increasing. It's still not as high as I would like it to be. It's about a little less than 500,000 Americans learn currently on this very day, learn German. I could imagine it could be even higher. But I think we are content with the fact that more Americans choose German as a foreign language than they did some years ago. I'm encouraged by that, and I hope that even more will do so, let's say, 5 years from today.
Would you comment about the future of the euro and the challenges to the European Union given the debt crisis?
I think the future of the euro is very good. I believe that more countries will join the euro. We, as you might know, we have just the 17th country which will come in next year, Estonia. And if you look at the history, it's been quite successful. It's been quite successful because for some of us, it had lowered interest rates, and for others, it has reduced the cost of hedging currency, for instance, for Germany. But for instance, especially the Southern Europeans, it has brought lower interest rates. So I think it has been very successful for everyone in the euro area, and therefore I don't see any country, really not a single country, which would like to wish to leave it. There is no alternative to it, I believe. You could also see the success of the euro in how it got gained more and more ground as a reserve currency. It's more than 50% more reserve currency than at its beginning in 1999. And so I think it's a really unique success story. Now, of course, we all knew when we introduced the euro that there was a certain danger. Because, you see, the big debate was in the 1990s, and in the 1990s there were two theories. One theory was, let's introduce the euro immediately, because then we get these benefits, lower interest rates for the Southern Europeans and less hedging costs, for instance, for countries like Germany. That was one theory. The other theory was the so-called crowning theory. We can have a common currency only once we have not only a common monetary policy, but also a common fiscal policy. And at the time, the first theory did win. We introduced the European Central Bank, so we have one monetary policy now, but we don't have yet a fiscal policy. So I think what comes out of this crisis is that we are reminded that we have still work to do. We have to get our fiscal policies much more in line than we used to do it. You see, it just doesn't make sense when you have countries with very different kind of fiscal policies. If one country tries to make dramatic changes to enhance competitiveness, bitter changes like enhancing the time of the lifetime of work from 65 to 67, as we did in Germany, or trying to streamline the welfare system, as we in Germany, or things like that, painful. But I think you see in an area where if you have one currency, the lesson we have learned is that everybody needs to be on a similar line as that. Just a common monetary policy is not enough. And that will be the result. I'm very optimistic as far as Europe is concerned. I think Europe is, in my view, the greatest success story in international politics in the last 50 years. When you look back at European history, we had in the last between the mid-1500s and 1945, you had, for instance, just between France and Germany, 23 wars. 23 wars in a bit more than 300 years. And I think the integration of Europe has not only put an end to all of that, to this very destructive tendency of Europeans to lead war, one against each other, but I think it has also brought huge prosperity and economic stability. I think when you look at Europe today, you have not a single dictatorship in Europe. Between the two world wars, 28 of the 38 European countries were authoritarian regimes. And that means, or dictatorships, whatever you call it. And so I think we have made huge strides forward with the European integration. Peace, prosperity, democracy, rule of law. I think it's a uniquely successful experiment, and I'm very proud that we achieved the same what we had achieved in the western part of Europe after the wall came down in 1989, when we then began to, after the unification of Germany, when we worked hard to overcome the division of Europe and enlarge the European Union. Of course, we paid a price. And when we also enlarged NATO, but I think it was worth it. It was not cheap, but I think it was very much worth it. Every single cent, every single euro we spent on that was worth it, I believe.
The reference is made to some of the discontents that some Americans have about the years 33 to 45 with respect to Nazi Germany. And the question directly is, what is the German government doing? What is their approach or attitude toward that period of Nazi rule?
We believe there is no alternative to facing the truth. And therefore, every German student learns in school about 1933 to 1945. And the German government takes responsibility for what happened, although, of course, we have a different German government. And I'm very pleased to remark that on German television there have been more than 1,000 films about that. And, for instance, my ministry, the Foreign Office, we just commissioned some 5 years ago a study about the role of the Foreign Office in these years. And this report just came out about 2 months ago, and it was sold out within 3 days. 35,000 copies bought. It was not very flattering for the Foreign Office because it turned out that, like any other parts of the Nazi government, they had their role, and not a good one. And I must say that is, when you look at it from a deeper level, there is no alternative to not only not forgetting what happened, but to keep the memories alive, and also to teach what happened there, and also to accept it as a responsibility, because we firmly believe there is no reconciliation without accepting the truth, even if it's bitter, and even if your own country has done horrible things. There is no alternative to that. And of course, we are fully aware that money is can't really make those things not have happened. But I'm a bit proud of how the German government has handled that, and we have spent some 65 billion on payments to families, to Israel, to others. I know that is not the decisive thing. It's just a token of the responsibility which we accept. And I have the feeling that probably this did play a role when we had the chance to reunite our country, that people, our neighbors, and people all over Europe accepted that we took responsibility for that very dark period in our history. To answer your question, there is no National Socialist Party in Germany, and there's fortunately right now also no right-wing party. Fortunately, because as we all know, that is not true for all European countries, but for Germany it is true. Thank you.
Would you comment on the often perceived reality of the European countries being decidedly less eager to fight and risk lives in a variety of conflicts than is the United States? And if there is a divide like that, does that impact upon NATO's future?
First of all, sadly, also Germany had in Afghanistan many casualties. We have actually the fourth highest number of casualties. Fortunately, not as high as the United States, but still, we have 43 soldiers who died over there. And that is a fact. And the fact is also that in the north, where most of our troops are, there's bitter fighting these days. So it's no longer, are we ready? We're doing it. It's a, you would have basically every other day, you have fighting in which German troops are involved. Now, having said that, I repeat what I said before. You need security, you need soldiers, you need at sometimes also fighting, but that does not suffice. By just winning a battle, you never make out of a failing state a non-failing state. What you need to do is to bring good governance, to bring development, to bring opportunity, economic opportunity, to bring values which sustain a country. You need an elite, basically, which believes that there are goals which go beyond their own pocket or the pocket of your own family. And that is not easy. And I would say, as important as soldiers are, and as important as fighting is, that's only one part of the story. And therefore, I'm so happy about the decision taken by NATO, which accepts this fully comprehensive approach, which says the military is just one piece of the puzzle. We need all these other things. And for instance, you can't burn down poppy fields if you don't have an alternative livelihood for the person who planted them. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to burn the income of a person if you don't have an alternative for him how he can sustain his family. So it's all together. It's difficult sometimes. We have been successful in finding some of these alternative livelihoods, but not always. Some have worked, some have not worked. But I think and that I think is now unanimous, this is consent in NATO, that fighting alone does not solve any problem. It might be necessary in some cases, but it's only maybe a first step. It's also, by the way, also only the last means you resort to, because there are huge costs in each war which you lead. But still, the main lesson, and I think it's a lesson which we all have learned, all countries who are members of NATO, all countries basically, that you need it at some times. You need soldiers, sometimes for fighting, sometimes for just keeping the peace by other means, but you also need civilians, you need police, you need trainers, you need teachers, you need lawyers, you need prosecutors, and all of these other people. So it's part of the picture. My view, as you know, as you have said, I left the Foreign Service for a few years and worked directly for NATO. As you kindly said, for 3 different secretaries generals. It's not my fault that one of them died and one of them had to step down. The third one had a big career, though. And so I know a little bit about NATO from the inside, and I think it has a bright future. It has a bright future because if we wouldn't have it, we would have to invent it now.
One's always impressed, I think, by comprehensiveness and clarity, and something that's interesting and something that's helpful and informative. And I must confess, in listening to the ambassador, I completely missed the fact that we've exceeded our time to end the program. So I apologize to everybody for that, and I apologize to those who had questions and we couldn't get to them. Mr. Ambassador, wonderful evening. Thank you.